Hello and welcome to another video on changing the subject or rearranging formulae. In part 1 we looked at some simple equations that only involved one step, so in this video we're going to look at two-step equations. And I've got 3 examples to go through and then I'm going to give you a few questions to have a go at yourself. And I have put 2 important points here for whenever you're rearranging formulae, but I'll come back to these points as I go through each of these examples. So if we take a look at the first formula, we've got w equals 4x plus c, and we need to rearrange this formula to make x the subject. So at the moment w is the subject because w is on its own, so we need to get x on its own. So first of all, let's think about what's actually happening to x in this formula. Well, the first thing that's happening is that it's being multiplied by 4 because we've got 4x. So we multiply by 4 first and then we add on c. Now whenever we're rearranging formulae, we always work in reverse. So first of all, we need to get rid of this c. So how can we get rid of c? Well, to remove something, we do the inverse operation. So that's point number 1. So we are going to subtract c. Now we can't just subtract c willy-nilly from this formula because it's not going to be balanced. So whatever you do to one side of an equation, you do the same to the other side. So if we're removing c from the right-hand side, we need to take away c from the left-hand side. So what are we now left with? Well, on the left-hand side, we've got w minus c. And then on the right-hand side of our equation, well, these c's cancel out. So all we're left with is 4x. So we're getting further. We've got rid of this c. Now we need to deal with this 4 because we want x on its own. So what this means, this is 4 times x. So to remove something, you do the inverse operation. So what's the opposite of multiplying by 4? Well, that will be divide by 4. So I'm going to divide the right-hand side by 4, and obviously I'm going to divide the left-hand side by 4. So what am I left with? Well, on the left-hand side, I can just write all of this out. W minus c over 4. And on the right-hand side, all we'll be left with is x. So this is my answer. I have made x the subject. It doesn't matter that x is on the right-hand side. I could just switch these two things around, but this is absolutely fine as my answer. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. So we've got g equals h divided by n minus 2, and we need to make h the subject. So again, the first thing that's happening is we are dividing by n, and then we're subtracting 2. But because we're working in reverse, we need to deal with this minus 2 first. So to get rid of this minus 2, we do the inverse, so we need to add 2. So if I add 2 to the right, that means I have to add 2 to the left. So now what are we left with? Well, we've got g plus 2 on the left hand side, and on the right hand side all we're left with is this, so h divided by n. Now we're almost there, we just need to get rid of this n. At the moment we're dividing by n, so to remove something we do the inverse. So the inverse of dividing by n is to multiply by n. So I'm going to multiply the right by n, and I'm going to multiply the left by n. Now you just need to be a bit careful here. So it's not going to be, so on the left hand side we're not going to have n times g plus 2. So I'm not going to write n times g plus 2. That would be wrong. Okay, we're multiplying this whole expression by n. So what we can do is we can write n and then we can put in brackets g plus 2. So we've got g plus 2 and we're multiplying by n. So just having this n outside the brackets, that means multiplication. And then obviously on the right hand side, I'm just left with h, and I'm done. I've made h the subject. Okay, let's look at the last one. So we've got m equals a plus 5 divided by p, and we need to make a the subject. So again, let's think about what's happening to a. We're adding 5 first, and then we're dividing by p. So we need to get rid of this p first, because we're working in reverse. So the opposite of dividing by p is to multiply by p. So I'm going to multiply the right by p, and I'm going to multiply the left by p. So on the left hand side I've got m times p. Well, I can just write that as mp. I don't need to write the multiplication. And then on the right hand side, well, those p's cancel, so all I'm left with is a plus 5. A plus 5. And now all we need to do is get rid of this 5. So to get rid of the positive 5, I'm just going to subtract 5, and I'm obviously going to do that from both sides. So on the left hand side I've got mp minus 5, and then on the right hand side all I'm left with is a, and we are done. So hopefully you can see that the process for each of these is exactly the same, even though the formulae are completely different. You just need to remember the order in which you're doing things. So you always work in reverse whenever you're rearranging formulae. Okay, so I've got 9 questions for you to have a go at. So pause the video and see if you can rearrange each of these 9 formulae, and for each one you need to make x the subject. So question number 1, 8 equals d times x minus t. So we are multiplying by d first and then subtracting t. So we're going to work in reverse. So let's first of all get rid of this t. So we need to add t to both sides. So if I add t to both sides, on the left hand side I'm left with 8 plus t. And on the right hand side, well, these t's cancel out, so all I'm left with is dx. And if you are familiar with WWF, or if you did watch WWF back in the day, then dx will be familiar to you. So we need to get x on its own. So at the moment we're multiplying by d, so we need to do the opposite, which is to divide by d. So I'm going to divide both sides by d. So what I'm left with is, on the left hand side I've got 8 plus t over d, and on the right hand side I'm just left with x. So this is my final answer. Question 2, p equals 2x plus 2y. So if we're making x the subject, first of all we need to get rid of this 2y. So the opposite of adding 2y is to subtract 2y. I'm going to do that to both sides. So on the left hand side I'm left with p minus 2y, and on the right hand side, well, I'm just left with 2x. And now finally, to get rid of this 2, at the moment we're multiplying by 2, so I need to divide by 2. I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and that's going to leave me with, on the left hand side, p minus 2y over 2, and on the right hand side I'm just left with x. Be careful, we can't simplify this anymore. A lot of people like to try and divide the 2 by the 2, but you can't do that because we've got this whole expression divided by 2. So this here is my final answer. Question 3, w equals x over 6 minus 5. So if we first of all get rid of this minus 5 by adding 5 to both sides. So on the left hand side we've got w plus 5. And on the right hand side, I'm just left with x over 6. And then finally, what do we want to do? We want to get rid of this divide by 6. So if we multiply both sides by 6, so multiply the right by 6 and multiply the left by 6, what are we left with? Well, we've got 6, and then that's being multiplied by w plus 5. And on the right hand side, well, all I'm going to be left with is x. So this is my answer. Question 4, 2c equals x plus t, all of that over m. So at the moment we are adding t and then dividing by m, so we need to deal with the m first. So the opposite of dividing by m is to multiply by m. So I'm going to multiply both sides by m. So 2c times m, well that's just 2cm, 2 centimetres. And on the right hand side we're just left with x plus t. And now we can get rid of this t. So if we subtract t from both sides, we're left with 2cm minus t. And on the right hand side, we're just left with x. And we have made x the subject. Question 5, a equals a half bx. So at the moment we are multiplying by a half b. So we could divide by a half b, but I'm just going to do this in 2 steps. So first of all, I'm going to get rid of this half. And to do that, we can just multiply by 2, because a half times 2 is 1. So those 2 terms will just cancel. So if I multiply both sides by 2, on the left hand side, I'll be left with 2a. And on the right hand side, I'll just be left with bx. And now we can get rid of this b. So instead of multiplying by b, we can just divide both sides by b. So if I divide both sides by b, I'm going to be left with 2a over b. And on the right hand side, I'm just going to be left with x. So this is my final answer. Question 6, v squared equals u squared plus 2ax. So getting slightly trickier now. So first of all, I'm going to deal with all of this. So at the moment, we've got u squared. So let's just get rid of this u squared by subtracting u squared. So if I subtract u squared from the right and subtract u squared from the left, well, I'll be left with v squared minus u squared. And on the right, obviously, these terms will cancel. So all I'm left with is 2ax. So we're getting closer. Now, to get x on its own, at the moment we're multiplying by 2a, so I can just divide by 2a. So if I divide the right-hand side by 2a, I obviously have to divide the left-hand side by 2a. I'm running out of room. But on the left-hand side, I've got v squared minus u squared, all of that over 2a. And then on the right-hand side, these two a's will cancel, so I'm just left with x, and this is my answer. Question 7, v equals a plus x squared. So first of all, let's get rid of this a. I can subtract a from both sides. So on the left-hand side, I've got v minus a, and then on the right-hand side, I've just got x squared. Now, we want to get rid of this x squared. We just want x. So how can I get rid of this squared? Well, the inverse of squaring is square rooting. So I need to square root both sides. So if I square root the right-hand side, I need to square root the left-hand side. So on the left-hand side, I've got the square root of v minus a, because we're taking the square root of this whole thing. And then on the right-hand side, well, we're just left with x, because if we square root something and then square it, we're just back to that original number or original variable. So this here is my answer. Question 8, w equals the square root of x over k. So this is a case where you need to be really careful about the order in which you're doing things. So what's happening to x? We are dividing by k and then we're taking the square root. So to work backwards, we need to deal with the square root first. So how can we get rid of this square root? Well, the inverse of square rooting is squaring. So if I square the right, that will get rid of the square root. But I obviously have to square the left as well. So on the left-hand side, I've got w squared. And on the right-hand side, well, it's going to remove the square root, so we'll just be left with x over k. And now we can get rid of this k. So at the moment, we're dividing by k, so I just need to multiply by k. So multiply the right by k, multiply the left by k. So on the left-hand side, I've got k times w squared. Well, I can just write that as k w squared. And then that obviously just equals x, and we are done. And finally, the last question. So well done if you have persevered and managed to get through this video until this point. So we have t is equal to x plus c, and all of that is being squared. So first of all, we're adding c, and then we're squaring. So we need to get rid of this square first. And the inverse of squaring is square root. So we need to square root the right and square root the left. So on the left, we've just got the square root of t. And on the right-hand side, well, it's got to get rid of this square. So we're just left with x plus c. And finally, just to get rid of the c, we can just subtract c from the right and subtract c from the left. So we have got, on the left-hand side, be careful, it's not the square root of, it's not going to be the square root of t minus c. That would be incorrect. It's the square root of t and then minus c. So the c is separate from the square root. And then on the right-hand side, we've just got x. So this here is my final answer. So how did you get on with those 9 questions? Hopefully you noticed that as I was going through all of my workings out, even though all of the questions were completely different, the process that I used for each question was the same. So that's really important with these types of topics. So I'm going to leave it there for this video, but I'm going to do one more video on this topic, and we're going to look at some slightly more complicated formulae where the variable that we want to make the subject appears in more than one place. So hopefully you'll join me for that video, and thanks again for watching. Take care.